our scripture this morning, starting in Luke chapter 24, verses 1 to 6 in the NIV. On the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were wondering about this, suddenly 2 men in clothes that gleamed like lightning stood beside them. In their fright, the women bowed down with their faces to the ground. But the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, he has risen."
When they came back from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the others. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, and the others with them who told this to the apostles. But they did not believe the women, because their words seemed to be like nonsense. Peter, however, got up and ran to the tomb. Bending over, he saw the strips of linen lying by themselves, and he went away wondering to himself what had happened.
He is risen. Wow, you do that well. You do that so well. And if you've been a believer for any number of years, been to any resurrection services, that becomes almost an automatic response when you hear that phrase. He is risen. We respond with enthusiasm. We respond with joy. We're delighted that Jesus is risen. We understand it's central to our faith. We read 1 Corinthians 15, if Christ not be raised, you of all people most miserable. But we don't have to be miserable. We can be joyful because he is risen. Yeah, there's an echo. See, there's an echo. That's perfect. But when you read through the gospel accounts of the resurrection, the response of those who first heard he is risen was nowhere near as confident. You read through it and you see that they had a little bit of confusion, misunderstanding, fear. What I want to do first is walk through a few of the Gospels and just some of the responses that they came. Matthew describes an earthquake, an angel of the Lord frightening the guards, frightening the women who came to the tomb. And then after it says, so the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid, yet filled with joy. They ran to tell the disciples. And then later, when the disciples see Jesus in Galilee, in Matthew, we're told that when they saw him, they worshipped, but some doubted. When we get to Mark, I actually want to read a lot of the section in Mark from 8 to 14. And it says that, trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. When Jesus rose on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had driven 7 demons. She went and told those who had been with him and who were mourning and were weeping. When they heard that Jesus was alive and that she had seen him, they did not believe it. Afterward, Jesus appeared in a different form to 2 of them who were walking in the country. These returned and reported to the rest, but they did not believe them either. Later, Jesus appeared to the 11 as they were eating. He rebuked them for their lack of faith and their stubborn refusal to believe those who had seen him after he had risen. You get a little bit of a theme coming out here? You get into the book of John. Mary Magdalene, when she found the empty tomb, we're told this. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one who Jesus loved, and she said, "They've taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him." So Peter and John, they run to the empty tomb. They saw the empty tomb, the cloth had been wrapped around Jesus, and it said they believe, sort of. And then John, who throughout the gospel has these little aside phrases as he tells about something and he says, and did you know this other thing? Because John was there. He says, they still did not understand from the scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. And then we're told a little later in John about Mary who saw 2 angels. And they asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "They've taken away my Lord," she said. "I don't know where they have put him." At this she turned around and saw Jesus standing there. But she did not realize that it was Jesus. He asked her, "Woman, why are you crying? And who is it you're looking for?" Thinking it was the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." And then, of course, we have Thomas. We have Thomas they say, "We've seen the Lord," and he says, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand to his side, I will not believe." So when the followers of Jesus first heard, "He is risen," what was their response? Fear? Skepticism? Confusion? Even when Jesus appeared to some of them, they didn't even recognize him, and they doubted. Their response was uncertainty, bewilderment. Our brains are amazing devices. Our brains do all sorts of things. They take care of all the bodily functions, the automatic ones that we don't even think about, and they do that faithfully year after year and decade after decade. They enable us to figure out all sorts of complex problems and to invent and build all sorts of amazing things. And our brains can store an incredible amount of information and recall it just like that. Usually. Sometimes there's a glitch, right? But we can recall all sorts of things. But you know the one thing the brain is not very good at doing? Changing our mind. We can do all of those things, but once we become convinced of something, we're very slow to reverse our thinking. Have you ever tried to get someone to change their mind on something that they don't want to change their mind about? When we have a firm opinion, we can listen to all sorts of testimonies from others. We can all listen to all sorts of information, scientific information, other information, and it can completely contradict what we believe, but what we know is right. Isn't that so? Shakespeare knew that. He said, "The one convinced against their will is of the same opinion still." He knew that way back then, right? Today, I want to explore two resurrection appearances in the book of Luke. They have some fascinating parallels in them. And as I reflected on these two texts, on these two questions surfaced. So I want to explore those questions. The questions are this: how did Jesus turn skeptics into believers? And then the other question is, how do we help skeptics become believers? So those are the two things I want to explore as we consider some of those stories. Now, one story you heard in the song, and didn't you feel like you were in a medieval court? Wasn't that the feel of it? You know, that is just really neat kind of a feel to that song. And it told the story of the two men walking on the road to Emmaus. I'm going to read some of it. You probably have read that before. You can find it in Luke chapter 24. And we read a lot of the Easter story from Luke. When it talked about, they were wondering about this, suddenly two men in clothes gathered. They gleamed like lightning. They stood beside them. In their fright, the women bowed down, their faces to the ground. The men said to him, "Who do you look for? Why do you look for the living among the dead?" Disciples get up, they run to the tomb, and they're wondering what had happened. Like the other Gospels, in Luke, the first response is, "What's going on? What happened?" And then we pick up the account of the two men on the road to Emmaus. Quick summary of that event is like this. On that day of resurrection, after there'd been all of that confusion, they discovered the empty tomb. There's two followers of Jesus, and they're walking to a place called Emmaus. They're discussing everything that happens. And Jesus shows up and says, "Hey, what are you guys talking about? What are you discussing?" And they said, "Really? Where have you been? Have you been living under a rock? All the things that have been happening in Jerusalem, are you the only one that doesn't know about these things?" And Jesus says, "Oh, really? What things?" You can almost see a smile on his face as he's saying that, can't you? And he's just like, "What if?" And so they tell him a little bit more about it. They blurt out their summary about the powerful prophet who was killed, and they hoped he was the one to redeem Israel. But now it's the third day, and some of the women had told them about this story about the empty tomb and a vision of angels, and some of the companions they found out, and they saw the empty tomb, but they didn't see Jesus. And in short, they're saying, we don't know what's going on. We don't know what to make of it all. So Jesus backs up and he starts with Moses and the prophets. And he starts to connect the dots of how it all fits together. I just love this passage because every time I read it, I could just hear them talking and, correcting one another and getting all it. And then Mary said this, and no, it wasn't Mary, it was Mary, the other Mary. And that Mary saw the angel, and that Mary saw the one sitting on the tomb, and all of these stories. And then Peter and John went, and Peter went and saw the tomb first, and they're just talking over one another, and Jesus is just listening and listening to what they're saying. You read that story. And if you're following online, read the Easter story in Luke, all of Luke chapter 24. It is just so rich. So how did Jesus turn these skeptics into believers? Now, a simple answer is, well, he showed up. And they saw him. But even when they saw him, they didn't recognize who it was. How did he turn skeptics into believers? Well, the people on the road to Emmaus, first of all, he did this. He asked about their perspective. He asked about their understanding. He asked them, what are you discussing together as you walk along? That's in verse 17. And their faces were downcast. And one said, are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know about the things that have happened here in these days? And he says, what things? You think at that point, Jesus could have jumped in and said, oh, let me tell you, here's exactly what happened. But he doesn't. He lets them talk first and say, what things? What are the things that you are discussing? What's your take on all of the events? What do you think about that? What do you think actually happened? You talk about a powerful prophet. What do you think about that prophet? What about the leaders and the chief priests? What do you think happened? Why do you think that had happened? Of course, Jesus could have given a far more accurate description than their jumbled dialogue. And there was a time for that, but not yet. First, he asked about their perspective, about their understanding. Then, he built on their understanding. It says, and beginning with Moses and the prophets, explained to them all that was said in the scriptures. Now, of course, these were Jewish men. They had read Moses and the prophets from the time they could read. They had listened to Moses and the prophets in the synagogue week after week after week. That was familiar to them. We learn when we can attach new information to things that we already know. So Jesus backed up and he talked about those stories, about those events, those things that were already firmly implanted in their minds. And that allowed new information to take root, to take hold. It put a firm placeholder in their minds. So when Jesus told them, this is how it fits, they went, oh, in that story about Moses, in that story about the prophets, that's what it means. He attached it to things they already knew. And then that made a difference. So he built on the understanding that they had. And then what did he do? Well, then he shared a meal with them. And I love this part of the story too, where he pretends he's going to go further and they convince him to stay for a meal. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going further, but they urged him strongly, stay with us, for it's nearly evening, the day is almost over. So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us. Then their eyes were opened, and he recognized them. It was only when he broke bread with them. Suddenly they remembered him teaching about being the bread of life. They remembered when he fed the 5,000. They remembered perhaps a time when they themselves had shared a meal with him in another location. And suddenly they knew. It says they returned and told the disciples and said, verse 35, they told them what had happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. Isn't that a significant phrase? Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. So that's how he shared truth. That's how he turned skeptics to believers on the road to Emmaus. But what about the other disciples? What did he do then? Well, he asked about their perspective. He asked about the understanding. He met with the other disciples and he said, "Why are you troubled? And why do doubts arise in your mind?" He asked them about their story, about what was going on in their head, how they were understanding everything that was happening. And then he built on their understanding. This time he didn't turn to the scriptures, but he turned to something they knew very well. Flesh and blood, his body. He said, "Here I am. Here's my hands. Here's my feet. Look at my hands and feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have." When he said this, he showed them his hands and feet. Again, he had this new information. I'm alive. And that didn't fit what they knew, what they understand actually happened. But he attached that to things that they already know. Look, it's actually real flesh. It's really, really me. And then, what did he do? This was still not enough. Because in verse 41 it says, "And while they still did not believe it, because of joy and amazement, he asked them, 'Do you have anything here to eat?' And they gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it in their presence." Again, the meal seems to be the tipping point. That's what finally convinced them that this is indeed Jesus. In fact, in both of these texts, there's a very significant phrase. It is the turning point in their lives. It says that their eyes were opened and their mind was opened. Then their eyes were opened and they recognized him and they disappeared from his sight. When did that come? After they had broken bread together. After they had eaten together. Then he opened their minds so they could understand the scriptures. When did he understand that? After he had eaten a meal with them. After he had eaten that fish with them. So the next question that we have to ask is, how do we help skeptics become believers? What should we do? Any ideas? Maybe ask them about their perspective. Ask them about their understanding. Maybe build on their understanding. Maybe share a meal with them. Maybe the biggest mistake that we make as we try to share our faith is that we start talking too much. We do far too much telling and far too little listening. People have a perspective, they have an understanding. They have an understanding of how the world works, they have an understanding of how faith works or doesn't work. They have an understanding about what religion is. And unless we actually take the time to say, "Tell me, what do you think?" They're not going to hear what we say unless they feel that we have heard them. Ask about their perspective. Ask about their understanding. The disciples who walked with Jesus, they were frightened. They were confused. What are the things that trouble them the most about the world around them? What are the things that trouble them most about their own inner world? It'll take a lot more discussion to get to that point when people are willing to actually say, this is really something I'm struggling with. It's a lot easier to say, well, this is all the problems in the world and what's happening in Ottawa or what's happening in there with the government and all of those. And there's lots of problems that people will be happy to talk about there. And have you ever noticed that in all of those big macro things, we just love the negative headlines? You notice this past week there was the ice storm in Quebec, and first it says 1 million people are going to be out of power, and then it says hundreds of thousands of people are still without power, and then now it's 100,000 people or 100,000 homes. But they don't flip it around and say, after a terrible ice storm, we've had 900,000 homes return to power. They don't say that, do they? They say, the ones that's what's going wrong. We fixate on what's so terrible, what's going wrong. But as people are starting to wring their hands and fret and say, oh, this is so bad, we are people of hope. We know there is a God who is in control. We know there is hope. We know there is a future. And so we can share with hope. And we do that as we build on their understanding. How do we build on their understanding? Chances are you have far more common ground with them than you realize. Often when we're sharing with people, we dive into all the points of disagreement first. Well, what about this issue? What about this issue? What about, and you can list all of the issues. But what about the things that you actually agree on? Even in the polarized world, there's a lot of things. Now, maybe there's some common topics like sports or recreation or things that you like and enjoy doing, and that's great to start with that. But even that, beyond that, what about people's values? Things that they hold dear. Most people have a value of family. Most people want peace and security and prosperity. Most people have a sense of beauty and wonder. How do they engage in that? Is it through art? Is it through music? Is it through something else? Most people have a sense of right and wrong. And though there is disagreement in where that line exactly falls, I can guarantee that you get on the right topics and people will have a very firm view of right and wrong. And once we say, yeah, there is right and wrong, we maybe are in the place when we have that point of understanding then to ask some new information. Where do you think that comes from? What's the foundation for that sense of right and wrong? But unless we have asked about their perspective, unless we've built on that understanding by connecting truth with what they already know, what they already value, chances are they won't hear us. In that passage in Acts 17, when Paul was in the city of Athens, he began by recognizing all the statues they had to different gods. And he says, I even noticed there's one you have here to the unknown God. And then he quoted one of their poets. Those familiar ideas became the starting point that he used to help people understand the God who made the world and everything in it. He backed up a lot further. He didn't start with the scriptures there because they didn't know the scriptures, they didn't understand the scriptures, but he said, you've got an idea of God. You've got some idea of spiritual truth. Where does that come from? And once there was some dialogue flowing, he said, let me tell you about the God who made the earth and everything in it. People will be drawn to spiritual truth and recognize Jesus more easily when we start with the ideas that are familiar with them and areas of agreement rather than areas of contention, areas of disagreement. And share a meal with them. I'll keep this point fairly short. A steak is more convincing than a sermon. A pizza can have more persuasive power than a proof text. Now, that might be overstating things a little bit, but the point is that a relationship is far more important than a truckload of information. God sent us not just a book, He sent His Son. He sent His Son who came and lived among us. And when Jesus was here and lived among us, what was He criticized for? In Luke 15, that famous passage, the lost coin, the lost sheep, and the lost son, it starts out by saying the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, well, this man welcomes sinners and he eats with them. Can you imagine? And that's what launched that famous parable. How often have we been accused of saying, do you know who they ate with? Do you know who they're having lunch with? But it was when Jesus broke bread with them, the two disciples, their eyes were opened and they recognized him. It's only after Jesus ate fish with his disciples there that their minds were opened to the scriptures. How often in our efforts of evangelism do we jump in and we start at the wrong place? We need to start with a person. We need to start building that relationship with them. So a little bit of food for thought, pun intended. First of all, a word to skeptics. Now, as we gather here this morning, we all gather and I say, he is risen, and you say, he is risen indeed, and we're all on the same page, right? But there may be some who are watching online, or there may be some who even come here this morning and say, you know what, I've got some questions. I fall into that skeptic camp every once in a while. Well, you're in good company. Because all of the apostles, they were skeptics before they were believers. It was part of their journey. But Jesus met them. And Jesus wants to meet you. And our prayer for you is that Jesus will bring some people alongside you. People that will ask you about, what's your understanding? People that will listen to your journey, your story, the things that you value, the things that you hold close and dear. And people that will just share life with you and maybe share a pizza and a steak or something like that. And you'll have that relationship. And eventually, you'll come to recognize Jesus. And you'll recognize Jesus because Jesus is risen. And he lives and he resides within people who have placed their faith and trust in him. By his Holy Spirit, he lives within us. And once people recognize Jesus living in us, then perhaps their minds will be opened. Doesn't mean we have to have all the answers, but it means that we need to be walking with Jesus and trust that Jesus will make himself known to people if we just reach out and love people. And a word about evangelism. How often are we more concerned about convincing people than loving people? And we love people when we listen to them. We love people when we connect spiritual truth to things that they already understand. We love them as we build a relationship with them. And that'll likely involve at least some coffee, maybe some meals. It will involve spending that time together. How do we grow our church? Do we need better events, better programs? Do we need better answers to the tough questions? Maybe we just need better relationships. We need to spend more significant time with people who are far from God and to be able to just love them into the kingdom. Because skeptics will not change their minds in response to clever answers. Skeptics will not hear the scriptures that are quoted by strangers. But when we share a meal, they might notice the Spirit of Jesus who lives within us. And then maybe their eyes will be opened.